Today I'm going to be reading through the Frostblood series. So there are 3 books: Frostblood, Fireblood, and Nightblood. And I'm just going to be taking you guys along as I read, give some updates, and discuss my thoughts on the series as a whole, the characters, the world building, and all of that. So it is a cozy one, so grab your snacks, get cozy, and let's get into it.
So I'm about 60% into Frostblood, and just some general thoughts. The story is so formulaic. It feels like you could have plugged into ChatGPT, like, write me a fantasy outline, and she just followed it to a T. So that's not that exciting. I feel like the book's pretty predictable at this point. Like, there's nothing that's really surprising me or shocking me or something new. It just kind of feels like a generic fantasy novel at this point. I know this is definitely painted as like enemies to lovers a little bit, but it's definitely like, oh, I kind of distrust you and dislike you, and actually just kidding, like, I have a crush on you is how it feels. So like, I'm not even 60% in yet, and like, there's already been action in that department, so didn't love that. I typically like more of a slow burn, but I'm interested to see where this book goes, just because the point of the book that we're at right now, it's kind of getting more into like the main action, if you will. I'm interested to see if the main conflict in this book, I'm trying not to say too much because like, I don't obviously want to give stuff away. I'm trying to see if the main conflict of the story so far, like the whole reason she's kind of doing what she's doing right now, will be resolved by the end of book 1, because I know this is a trilogy, or if it will take until book 3 for it to be resolved. So I think that could also present an interesting point for this series. If everything is resolved in book 1, and then book 2 and 3, it's kind of just like offshoots of what happens, and then it gets a little bit more nuanced and detailed in the next 2 books, it will almost feel like the pacing is too fast. But again, I don't know, because I'm not there yet. But if everything doesn't get resolved by book 1, I will be interested to see how much of a cliffhanger she'll leave us on with this. Like, will it be a yeah, I get it, but I'm not that interested in book 2, or will it be like, that was an amazing cliffhanger, what the heck is gonna happen next? So we shall see. This book is also interesting because, like I said, it feels very formulaic, but it's also an interesting concept for sure, but I wouldn't say it's super original, which I'm not saying that every book has to be original, but at the same time, I feel like it's definitely a disservice that this book feels very plot point 1, plot point 2, plot point 3, and at least that's how it's feeling right now. So I will be intrigued to see if she breaks from that at all in the rest of this book or in the next 2 books. If I choose to continue reading them, I think it really depends on how this book wraps up, if I want to keep reading it. And right now, I'm in between, so we will see.
I have some thoughts. So I just finished Frostblood, which is the first book in the Frostblood trilogy. And I gave it 2.5 stars out of 5 because there are just some things with it that I didn't love. So I'm gonna unpack that really quickly. And then I have decided to read the second book in the series, which is Fireblood. So I will keep you guys coming along with me as I dive into that. And then we'll see if I want to read book 3. Normally, if I gave the first book 2.5 stars, I wouldn't be reading the rest of the series. However, I feel like this series specifically has some potential to improve a lot in the second book. I mean, I may be eating my words later, but I just think that how it's been set up, that it could potentially get better. I don't feel like a lot of series that start off pretty low, I give that chance to, but you know, 2025, I'm giving a chance to the series. So just some initial thoughts. I feel like overall with Frostblood, the pace was really rushed. It seemed like the beginning events happened so fast. It would have been a better introduction, I feel, if it was a bit slowed down more. So I think in the beginning you kind of meet your protagonist and you see some of the background stuff that happens that ultimately drives her through the rest of the novel, and I think that could have been slowed down, unpacked a little bit more, basically just given the readers more of a chance to warm up a little bit to the world. So that's my first critique. I also think that the romance between the two main characters happened almost insta-love-esque. It's kind of marketed as a enemies to lovers, and it is not that. It's definitely, I just kind of dislike you, and oh, just kidding, I've actually fallen for you. So that aspect I didn't love. Like, if it's labeled enemies to lovers, I want it to be like true enemies to lovers. And I'm also just someone who loves a slow burn. I don't love the whole insta love. It just, like, the slow burn, the tension, that payoff is just so good, and I think it's more realistic. My biggest issue with Frostblood was it felt so predictable. It felt like this author basically took the fantasy debut formula and copy and pasted. Like, I could have predicted everything that happened in this book before it happened. The beginning, the middle, like all the character relationships, what happened. It just felt very predictable, which I do not love, which was probably the biggest factor in me rating it so low. I think that I need to give this series one more book just because I think that it has a lot of potential, and that if we can break away from the formulaic way book 1 was written, that it could actually be a really interesting story, because I think the world is super cool and creative. Of course, like, it's not the most original thing I've ever read, but I think that it has potential, and so I'm reading book 2. It also felt like everything was resolved too quickly. Everything that happened in book 1 should have taken 2 books to complete. Like, at the end of book 1, they've accomplished like the one goal they set out to do. I'm trying to keep this relatively spoiler free, so if you want to read this, I apologize for that probable spoiler. I feel like them completing their goal should have taken at least 2 books, and it took 1, and like everything just felt super rushed. I feel like if we would have unpacked it and had more detail, more of a chance for the readers to really connect with the characters, it would have been able to get stretched out longer and be a deeper, more immersive story. I also really liked from the first book the very subtle commentary about how physical appearance is not everything. It's very subtle, but I did enjoy that one of the main characters has a pretty significant physical disfigurement from something that happened in their life, and I think that this author didn't really comment on that super heavily. Like, it's not a book I would say, hey, this book really addresses that, but I did like how the author kind of used it as a way to comment on looks are not everything, and looks are not something that someone should be ashamed of because of something that happened to them. And so, like I said, it's a very subtle, but I did enjoy her pulling in that aspect, because ultimately I think that is somewhat of a redeeming quality for this book, just because of that commentary, letting, you know, readers know, potentially young readers know, that hey, like, that is not the end all be all. And you could even stretch it so far as to say how we as a society teach kids about people who physically look different from us. Again, I would say that's kind of stretching it at this point, but I think that's a big plus. It's just that that was addressed in this book. So I am now on to Fireblood.
I just finished Fireblood, and it's definitely better than Frostblood was. I think the direction the plot took was definitely better and more thought out, and I think that it gives the series more of a leg to stand on. However, there's still some things that I think could have been executed better, and I think I'm gonna end up giving it 3 stars. I gave Frostblood 2.5, and I'm sure I'll have other thoughts when I have a chance to stew on it and really think about it, but I think the biggest thing is that it's still pretty predictable. Like, aside from one spoilery thing that I can't address, it still felt like everything was predictable. Like, I could have told you everything. I could have told you about the ending, like the characters that were involved in that. I could have literally written that out for you, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it suggests good foreshadowing. However, there was one thing at the end which just felt like it came out of left field, and so the one thing that was not predictable still kind of felt almost like it didn't really fit with the story. It kind of just felt like she was searching for something to continue the story instead of making this book longer and just ending the series at 2 books. So we will see. I'm sure I'll have more thoughts in the morning and when I have a chance to kind of process it all and collect more thoughts.
So I'm done with book 2, and I wanted to give some thoughts before I moved on to book 3, because I found that if I don't stop and give my thoughts, they tend to run together, and then I forget what happened in book 1 versus book 2 versus book 3. So I'm briefly going to give my thoughts on Fireblood, and I'm going to move right on to Nightblood. My first thought is the love triangle that gets set up. Not for me. I think that the way that Ruby left Arcus was a little weird. Like, I think that the decisions she made and the things that he said was just, it felt like they were super young, and it felt very classic miscommunication trope. So that I didn't love. And then we got introduced to Kai, who actually was a big highlight of the novel. I think he was really funny and lighthearted, and he introduced some interest to the Fireblood side of the world. And so I did not hate him being there, but I didn't love the fact that he was introduced for the sake of a love triangle. What was also interesting to me about Kai was that when Ruby first met him, he was super snarky and funny and made jokes about him being the exception to all the rules. And I thought he was actually a really interesting character, and he had a lot of dynamic traits that made him stand out on the page. But then as soon as Arcus shows back up, it's like he completely changed. He was a completely different person. And I think this could be one of 2 things. I think this was either to highlight Arcus and show that he is somehow better, and by doing that, the author had to pull focus from Kai, and so she did that by kind of just like making him feel different. Or, which would be a really cool thing if this was the intention, was the whole book is in Ruby's perspective, her POV. So if Arcus being back introduced was Ruby's revelation of, oh, like, I actually don't really care that much about Kai, and then this is how he differs. And so if it was for the purpose of, this is Ruby's POV, this is a way to show that Ruby is no longer seeing Kai in that potential light anymore, that could be really cool if that was the intention. I think I'm going to choose to believe that was the intention. It makes me feel better about it, not like Kai was just used as a plot device and then thrown away, which he probably was. I'm trying to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but I just want to say that I am 0% surprised at the characters who were present at the end of Fireblood. We're left on a bit of a cliffhanger that's not really a cliffhanger, which felt like it came so far out of left field. Like, I don't feel like there was any foreshadowing for the end of this novel. Like, I could probably go back and pick up hints on it, but I feel with how predictable the rest of the story has been, how the second book ended, felt like, huh, okay. But I'm not surprised at how some of the characters played into this ending, and kind of one of the revelations about the characters. I could have told you that from chapter 5 or whenever we meet this character. I could have told you that they would be present at the end. So I said that Frostblood felt predictable and Fireblood equally felt predictable, and I'm kind of think of it more critically, like, was it actually predictable, or was it just a little heavy-handed foreshadowing? Because obviously some foreshadowing is ideal. Like, you want to have some level of that so the story flows and is cohesive and realistic. And I'm trying to kind of gauge if the foreshadowing was just too heavy-handed or if it was just a predictable plot line. 90% of me says it's just a predictable plot line, and then 10% of me says, oh, the foreshadowing was just also super heavy. So it's probably a both and. The other thing that kind of surprised me was how Ruby's mom somehow got tied back into the end of Fireblood. It's another thing where it feels like there could have been foreshadowing for it that set this up. You could definitely tell this was the author's intention going into this series, but I think the specific reveal related to Ruby's mom needed more foreshadowing in book one. They could have felt like a plot hole in book one and ended up being tied back in at the end of the second book. But I still think the other reveal at the very end, specifically related to Ruby, was just really confusing. It wasn't so much confusing as it was just jarring. It just didn't feel like it made a ton of sense for where the story was going. But I also think that if Fireblood was 100 pages longer and the author took the time to just wrap up the series in 2 books instead of stretching it to a third one with that aforementioned crazy left field twist, I think that that would have been a more satisfying end to the series. Obviously, the second book would have had to have been written a bit differently, just all the stuff that happened there. I'll probably say that it should have been a 2-book series once I finish the third book, but can't really say at this moment. I'm also trying to keep in mind that this is this author's very first work, so it's her first series. Everyone starts somewhere. Comparing this to books by authors who have been writing for years and years and years, are very well established and further along in their craft and their career, it's a little hard to compare there. So I'm trying to keep an open mind with that, but that doesn't mean I'm just turning a blind eye to some issues I personally have with the book. That's kind of the point of art. It gets critiqued, it gets reviewed, it gets loved. So with that, my thoughts on Fireblood, I am now on to Nightblood. So I finished the Frostblood series, and overall it ended up being just as predictable as I thought it was going to be. Granted, there were some situations, circumstances, plot lines that ended up actually being a little bit surprising, but I blame that mainly on the fact that it kind of felt like it came out of left field and there was not a hint of foreshadowing about it. The series is okay. I don't think it's the worst thing I've ever read, nor is it anywhere close to the best thing I've ever read. But that's okay. You know, that's my opinion, and you can have your own opinion and disagree with me, and it is what it is. Like I said, it still felt really predictable. Some of the pairings at the end of the third book, kind of who ended up with who or who was interested in who, was so predictable, you know. There's no intriguing thing there. Throughout the series, there's kind of a discussion of a child of darkness and a child of light. We figure out pretty early on who the child of darkness is, allegedly, but then the child of light, they're kind of mentioned, but they're never really there. And then who it turned out to be is kind of like, well, obviously that's who they were gonna make it. However, there was like no foreshadowing for that, so it kind of just felt as though this made sense or this was typically done, so they just did it. There was also a situation at the very end of the book which was used as a source of motivation for the main character that was just so obvious that it was going to be undone afterward. There was a character who did something, and then it kind of served as a way for the main character to then fulfill what she had to do, and then it turned out that what the first character had did was able to be undone. So without spoiling anything, it just another predictable thing at the end of the book. There was a similar situation to what happens in a lot of fantasy novels where there is some kind of sacrifice that the main character has to make in order to fulfill their mission. In this case, the sacrifice that was made ends up getting undone. We see that in the epilogue, which it kind of loses the weight of that theme of just like, hey, I'm the one who's chosen to do this. I'm gonna go do this no matter what it takes. But then, just kidding, it actually didn't take anything. It just kind of like defeats that sacrificial theme in my eyes. I knew that's kind of where the author was going to go with it, like in terms of following a specific sacrifice. You want to see the gravity of a character's decision. You want to see them make the hard decision and come to terms with those consequences. You want to see how it affects their relationships, the world, the scenario at hand. And so when those actions that they take are walked back for the purpose of either a happy ending or how the author wants two characters to end up together, it just feels to me like not necessarily a lack of creativity, but it feels as though they are holding their story back from having a touch more meaning in that regard. So in my personal opinion, the more that you can see your characters go through allows the author to present a very unique perspective on how that character will react and how they'll grow and change through what they've been through. And that's such a redeeming quality in so many books that I enjoy reading, because you get to watch someone walk through the difficult tasks at hand. You get to see them kind of grow, evaluate their values, figure out who they are at the end of this grand adventure or at the end of this battle, this war, even just like this conversation or this incident in terms of not grand whimsical stories, but maybe just a literary fiction book. And I think that robbing the characters of feeling the weight of this sacrifice, it kind of just lowers the stakes and makes it so this character doesn't actually have to truly change or grow. They can stay exactly the same and then everything works out. But that's enough of me on my soapbox. I thought the final battle felt very rushed. It kind of felt like it took place too quickly. It seemed like everything coincidentally went the way of the good guys, which, you know, we always want the good guys to win, but I do want to doubt in battles. Like, I want the author to make me feel like, oh, they may not win this or may not make it out of it. I think it creates more intrigue, more tension. It really ropes you in, and it's just like, oh my gosh, I genuinely don't know how this is gonna turn out. That's a really fun part of books, and I just think the readers were a little robbed of that in the last installment. And then the last point that I want to touch on is I felt like the dialogue was really cringy. I just think the way that the two main characters interacted with each other and some of the stuff they said to each other, it felt very, of course this is YA, but it felt very young. It felt like they didn't communicate well. And then the author overused exclamation points, which takes me right out of the story. I don't know what it is, but I feel like exclamation points need to only be used when it's like the battle cry into something or it's really loud. I don't feel like exclamation points should be used like every other paragraph or multiple times in a chapter or even multiple times in a book. Honestly, I think I would reserve those for, like I said, really big, loud moments that you want to emphasize, because if you use exclamation points all the time, it just takes me out of the story, because then I picture the character yelling it, which I should be able to infer from what they're saying and the context of the dialogue and the conversation, the tone that they're using, and I feel that exclamation points just force it on you a little bit too much. So overall, I gave the series Frostblood, which was first, I gave that 2.5 stars, I gave Fireblood 3 stars, and I gave Nightblood 2 stars. So that averages out to exactly 2.5 stars for the entire trilogy. It definitely was not one of my favorites. It is not a world I will be coming back to. However, I did enjoy some aspects of the plot. I don't want to just focus on the negative. I think the world was really cool, and getting to see characters from like different nations was interesting to see how just kind of the culture that the author created differed between the Frostbloods and the Firebloods. I thought it was really interesting how she tied in some religion and mythology into this world. It wasn't just, oh, we're two nations and we have two governments and we're fighting over what we think should be right. It was more so, there is this history of these gods who created the world and created the Frostbloods and the Firebloods, and seeing how those gods kind of played a role with our main character and some of our side characters as well. Although there are some parts of the book that I did not love, one of them being the predictability, I still think that this is a series that many people would enjoy and like reading. I wouldn't absolutely say no, do not read this. I still think it is a story that could bring people a lot of enjoyment. However, me personally, I would not recommend it. Thank you so much for joining along on this reading vlog. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was a cozy time for you. If you would like to see more of these reading vlogs from me, please leave a comment down below. Please let me know any books you would like me to read next or get involved with. And if you like hearing from me, please subscribe to follow along with me as I post more videos, give you all of my book opinions, and just talk everything books. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. So thanks for watching, and I will see you again soon.